What's up, everybody? I hope you're doing well. I thought it might be helpful to share a little backstory on why I chose the counseling profession because, one, I'm looking for easy ways to make videos while I'm preparing for maternity leave and my time is limited, but I also thought it would be really helpful to share because I always wanted to hear other people's stories when I was making that decision, and also it's a fairly vulnerable story, which I think is true for a lot of us. So I just thought it might be helpful to go ahead and share why I pursued counseling as a profession. So if you're interested in hearing some real talk behind why this therapist decided to become a therapist, then keep watching. Welcome to Private Practice Skills. I'm Dr. Marie Fang, psychologist in private practice. I post videos offering tools I learned the hard way about starting and growing private practice so that you don't have to. And today, I'm going to share about why I chose the counseling profession, because why not? As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this is a real talk video. I'm going to share some vulnerable things because that is my story. This isn't a video where I give you a step-by-step how-to of how to figure out if you should join the counseling profession. I'm just going to share my story. And I think these things have a way of being a bit more organic than this sort of practical how to do this, do that. So let's get into the story. So I made the decision that I wanted to become a therapist at age 14, which I think is kind of young. I don't know if you can relate with that experience. Let me know in the comments because it seems kind of interesting to me to wonder, when do you kind of know that you want to be a therapist? Do we ever really know? But that's when I decided I wanted to be a therapist. And so I'm going to share the story of how I figured out by age 14 that I wanted to pursue the counseling profession. So ever since pretty much forever, I always struggled with a combination of physical health problems and anxiety problems. And those things had a way of looping on themselves, which if you're familiar with anxiety, chronic pain, they overlap together often. My story of physical health problems is rooted in an undiagnosed autoimmune disease that I had symptoms of my whole life until I was diagnosed at age 19. So the autoimmune disease that I have is called celiac disease, which at this point in time that I'm filming this, it is so well known, so much more is understood about celiac disease. But when I was a kid displaying symptoms of celiac disease in a fairly severe manner, people thought celiac disease was 1 in a million, and now we know it's a lot closer to like 1 in 100. So we just didn't have access to that information when I was a kid. The way it manifested when I was young is I pretty constantly had stomach aches from as young as I can remember. And in fact, as these things go, I just assumed that everyone had stomach aches because that's all I ever knew. I didn't really complain about it when I was really little because I had stomach aches all the time. I just assumed everyone has stomach aches. That's just normal. Now, over time, I did start to name my complaints about my stomach aches because they only got worse over time. And in fact, by the time I hit middle school, I would have batches of time that would stretch for weeks and sometimes months where I would just be writhing in pain. My family would take me to the ER, doctors, I mean, all the things you think you would do if your child was experiencing that level of pain. And basically no one knew what it was. Everyone said that it was psychological, which felt very invalidating. And to give a little more context, in addition to this physical health problem that was undiagnosed at that point, my family environment was also highly toxic, but not in a way that was obvious to me at all at the time as a kid, as a middle schooler. Somewhere in high school, I did start to figure that out. So I was always on edge, walking on eggshells because I was working so hard to try to please my family and be a good girl, all while my stomach really hurt all the time. Well, actually, turns out it was my small intestine that was hurting all the time. And by the time I was maybe 13 years old or so, the combination of needing to be a good girl, high performing in school and in my extracurriculars, while also feeling this constant pain was just absolutely not sustainable. And so what manifested was anxiety, which I didn't know that that's what that was at the time, but I started having panic attacks. Now, based on my memory, I couldn't tell you when my first panic attack happened or how quickly things progressed, but by the time I was 14, I was having multiple panic attacks every day, and it developed into panic disorder with agoraphobia. I know now the DSM-5 categorizes that differently, but that was the criteria that I met at the time. So the way this panic dynamic manifested for me is I had this very real trigger of pain in my intestines, which I feared that in and of itself. But what would also develop was this fear that I was maybe going to throw up or do something that was embarrassing around the intensity of pain that I was experiencing whenever I ate food. Also, every time I ate food, very shortly thereafter, I would experience very intense stomach pain, which made it really difficult for me to do any of my tasks, which at the time was things like going to school, doing my homework, and participating in ballet. Those were my things at the time, and when you're in 10 out of 10 pain, you can't focus, you can't get your homework done, you certainly can't perform athletically. And so all of those things were starting to decline for me, which only amped up my anxiety. So in time, I developed this relationship with pain and with food where before I even felt the pain, before I even ate the food, I would have an anticipatory anxiety that I was gonna be in pain, perform poorly, or maybe embarrass myself and throw up. And it just snowballed from there, and I would induce a panic attack because of all of this fear. So what I would try to do is try to avoid situations where I would have to eat food or be in pain when I needed to perform or when I was in front of other people. And that is where it started to develop into this sort of panic disorder, agoraphobia land. I didn't want to eat food at my friends' houses because what if I get sick after I eat, and then it's going to be embarrassing because I'm going to have to like be in the bathroom the whole time. And that was a reality-based fear, is that I would be in the bathroom the whole time, and I was very embarrassed about that. So let me try to like tell my friends I'm busy, or find a way to eat food kind of before and like wait until the pain passes and then go do this thing, or like maybe there's a way to like not eat lunch at school so I can still pay attention in class even though I'm really hungry. And then when I get home, I'll eat a bunch of food and then just be sick for the rest of the night, but no one's gonna see me. So I had this intense relationship with food, etc. This is a long backstory, but to sum up, let's just say by the time I was 14, I had very severe panic disorder with agoraphobia. I did not know at all that's what it was. I thought I was going crazy. So my pediatrician encouraged my family to take me to see a therapist. 14-year-old Marie sees her first therapist, and turns out that this therapist was terrible. Terrible, terrible. I can't remember everything about the therapy session, but what I do remember is that it was a male therapist who was significantly older, gray-haired. I was 14, mind you, and I remember during our session, he pulled he had like those rolling office chairs in his office, so I was sitting in one, and he pulled his rolling office chair right next to mine and had his hands on my knees while we were talking to comfort me. 14-year-old Marie was panicking on the inside, because that's what I did when I freaked out, and didn't say anything. But I told my mom that I was never going to go back and see him again. So I'm so grateful I was able to at least advocate to that extent that this clearly was not for me. Now, at this point in the story, this was like circa year 2000 or so, where we had internet, but it still made those dial-up noises, and you couldn't like find resources online in the way that we can so easily do that right now. So what I did at the time was I went to the library to try to understand what was going on, because I had this internal drive, and I don't know where it came from, but it was this narrative that repeated in my head of, I know I can do a better job than that therapist that I saw, because he was terrible. So I went to the library and I was trying to figure out what was going on. I can't remember all the different kind of rabbit holes I went down in the library, but it was like an entire summer of just going to the library as often as possible. At some point checking out books that were more kind of in the medical section of the library, and in time shifting to more the psychological side of things. Somewhere in there, I came to the conclusion that I had panic disorder with agoraphobia. And I know self-diagnosis is not a thing, but that's definitely what was going on for me at the time. And I found books on CBT and self-help and how to treat panic disorder using CBT. And I don't know where this notebook went, but I definitely had like a spiral notebook that I took with me to the library. I didn't even check these books out. I would just sit on the floor and take notes from the books into my spiral notebook, and basically filled a whole notebook with a thorough plan for how I was going to implement systematic desensitization so I could overcome my panic disorder, because I was determined that even if my stomach was going to feel the way it felt forever, which is what I believed at the time, at least I wouldn't have to panic about it. So I started systematic desensitization. It was like a 2-year journey, but already I was so interested in learning about CBT and how powerful the mind is in just influencing our body and our perspective of the world. I mean, I was afraid of everything. And I thought, wow, I really believe this is going to work. So at that point, even before I'd fully implemented this systematic desensitization, I had decided I'm going to be a therapist. And it was always this narrative of, if that guy could be a therapist and, supposedly make a living and be so terrible, I can definitely be a therapist. And this is so interesting to me to see what's happening in my own mind and my own body, and how much power we have to change that. So that was when I decided I wanted to be a therapist. But to finish the story, I did implement systematic desensitization on myself. It was probably a 2-year process, I would say, to go from my kind of lowest level item on my CBT hierarchy and move to the highest level items without experiencing a panic attack or fleeing, and eventually feeling comfortable in those situations that otherwise I would literally run away from instantly. Now, that was the moment in time when I made a decision that I wanted to become a therapist, but it definitely morphed over time. And even since becoming a therapist, my reasons for being a therapist are quite different than they were then. I mean, I want to be a better therapist than so-and-so is probably not the healthiest motivation for someone to become a therapist. But I think I was so angered by the injustice that I saw happening, though I wasn't able to articulate that at the time. And I felt so interested in the topic and thought, I just really want to do this. And that's been consistent over time. I've never gone back and questioned whether this is the right field for me. I just knew. And as I learned more, my reasons for wanting to be a therapist have shifted over time. I glazed over some significant parts of my mental health journey, and I just named that I grew up in a toxic family environment. There's a lot more to that story that I'm not going to get into in this video because I don't want to. But I've developed more insights around that over time as well, and even kind of my own tendencies to take on that kind of savior complex that I think a lot of therapists have inside of them. So it's a learning journey for all of us. Maybe in another video I'll talk about the savior complex. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that? We'll just leave it there. Well, there you go. That's the real talk story of how I chose the counseling profession. I always love hearing other therapists' stories of why they chose to be in this profession, because there does tend to be a pretty non-strategic, organic story of how we get here. It's not one of the default professions that people jokingly say, like, oh, become a doctor, lawyer, or engineer, or whatever it is. It's not like, oh, become a therapist someday. It's great, right? You have to kind of come into it through some path. So I hope you found it helpful to hear my story. And I'd like to thank TherapyNotes.com for sponsoring this video. Therapy Notes really helps make managing your practice as streamlined as possible, from scheduling to notes to billing to their HIPAA secure telehealth platform, which is included for free for all subscribed users. If you'd like to check out Therapy Notes, you can get 2 months to try it for free with no commitment just by clicking the link in the description of this video. And wherever you might be at in your career journey, I hope you found it helpful to hear my story of why I chose the counseling profession. And just keep in mind, this is my one individual story. Everyone's story is different, but I'd love to hear a little bit of your story of why you chose the counseling profession, or maybe why you're considering the counseling profession, in the comments below. And until next time, from one therapist to another, I wish you well.